Well, welcome to our continuing series of virtual town halls. If you're just joining us, we're holding these events every Friday at noon Mountain Time and every Tuesday at 5 p.m. You can find our events at andrewromanoff.com/live, and you can submit questions by going to our Twitter or Facebook pages. Those are at Romanoff 2020. Really appreciate your joining us, and I hope you and your family continue to be safe and healthy. I know we're going to get through this pandemic together. We're lucky today to have a panel of guests who each bring a different experience around public education and share my commitment to funding our public schools. Our state hasn't done a particularly good job at doing that relative to other states in the nation, but we know that public education is the bedrock of our democracy and the single best investment we can make in our economic health. My first guest, as I play virtual talk show host here, is my friend Kathy Kipp, who is a state representative from Larimer County. She was the president of the Poudre School District in Fort Collins. So she has been a school board leader, now a state legislator, and also brings perspective as a parent as well. So I want to say to you, Kathy, thank you very much for joining us. Or Representative Kipp, Your Honor, Your Excellency, tell me
Kathy,
what to call
please,
you.
Kathy.
I hope you're doing well, and your family too.
Oh yeah, we're doing great. We feel very fortunate to be comfortably ensconced here and have a house and a roof over our heads and enough food to eat, and just like everybody else, working hard to try and get through this.
Yeah, me too. So you and I are going to kick off a conversation here. We're going to be joined by two other folks that we both know well. Lisa Weil, who's Executive Director of Great Education Colorado, and Tracy Rainey, who's the Executive Director of the Colorado School Finance Project. Because we're talking a little bit today about school finance. And I know this is probably not what you signed up for when you joined the state legislature, the burden of cutting funding rather than actually improving programs. So tell us a little bit, I guess, starting with your perspective, when you were advocating for public schools as a parent, and then as a school board member, school board vice president, I think, and then became president of the Poudre Board of Education. So what's that like when times are tough and budgets are tight and cuts are deep? How can you as a parent make a difference?
Well, frankly, we were very fortunate in our district to have people who were very open with what the budget cuts were going to look like, right? And they actively sought the input of our parent community. They said, well, here's what the budget looks like. Here are the various options for cutting our budget, because we don't want to we want to keep the cuts as far away from the classroom as possible. So they did a series at that time, back in 2008, of forums where they invited parents, and they allowed us to come in and basically express our values, because really that's what budgeting is. It's saying, well, we have this much money, right? And so what's the most important thing to you? What shouldn't we cut? And are there things that are less important to you that we should cut? And I'd say that, moving over to the legislative side, that's where we end up now. It's still all about trying to align our values. And I think what we've heard from most education stakeholders is that we are trying to, I don't know where everybody and on the audience is, but we have something called the negative factor or budget stabilization factor in Colorado, which is how far we are behind in funding education from where we should have been according to Amendment 23. And
let me I'll pause to provide a little bit of context, because I know not everybody was in Colorado 20 years ago when Amendment 23 was adopted, or 28 years ago when the Taxpayer Bill of Rights was added, but the measure that you're talking about, Amendment 23, was meant to remedy at least some of the damage that budget cuts had done in the previous decade and get us back not to what you might call full funding, but at least to a level that wasn't so badly decimated, requiring the state, in other words, to increase school funding by an amount equal to inflation and population growth, plus for at least 10 years, 1% on top of that.
Yeah, it was inflation plus 1% for 10 years. And then when the Great Recession came along, there really wasn't enough money to do that, because public education is such a huge part of the state budget. We actually have to, as a state, backfill what the local governments don't put towards what we call our total program funding for each of our students. And so because of that, people think that their local property taxes pay for all of education, but that's not the case. The case is really that the state is on the hook for a lot of it. And so the less that your local communities put towards your funding, your total funding, the more the state has to chip in, it's actually very damaging to the state budget in terms of what's happened over the years.
It's a good point to bring in Tracy Rainey into this conversation. I know, Tracy, you're joining us as well, and you lead a group called the Colorado School Finance Project. I happen to know that because you and I teamed up along with other friends like Kathy Gephardt and Carrie Kennedy and Lisa Weil, who'll be joining us in order to try to improve school funding. You've dedicated your career to this, and I want to say thanks, and I hope you are doing well as too.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it. And yes, we've had a great opportunity to work together over the years, so appreciate it very much.
So Tracy, Kathy Kipp, Representative Kipp was just talking to us a little bit about trying to shield school budgets from deep cuts and the progress that we've made in the 20 years since Amendment 23 was passed. Can you give us just a big picture look here at the state? I think Representative Kipp and I were talking about earlier, is facing budget cuts now of more than $3 billion. Where does Colorado rank with respect to per pupil funding versus other states today?
Really looking at whatever metrics you want to use, or if you want to use the National Center of Education Statistics, U.S. Census Bureau, we're going to be within one of the lowest funded states in the country, within the bottom 5. And so now with the cuts that are looming, and obviously other states have those issues as well. But the thing that makes it challenging in Colorado is that our taxpayers don't have an opportunity to make adjustments in tax policy during recessions and during economic hardships. So the only thing that can happen is we make deeper cuts. And right now, there's a real concern that the amount of money owed to education, where there's already a debt owed of from the last recession of over $500 million, could easily double within this next budget year. That would mean that the cuts that K-12 have potentially will not be able to be restored. We weren't able to restore it in the last economic time when Colorado is one of the fastest growing economies. So, we were already in the bottom 5 of funding. I can't imagine that we would be able to improve without having additional revenue in this state.
Well, this is a conversation that you and I have been having for a long time, and you've been working on even longer, as well as Lisa Weil, who runs Great Education Colorado. I'm told that she is joining us, and we're going to have 3 of the best people I know to work on this issue, at least in the course of this conversation. Lisa, thanks for joining us too. Can you hear us okay, or are you muted?
You're muted.
Happy to be here.
I appreciate it. So Kath Kipp and Tracy Rainey and I just talking a little bit about what we're up against and what we've been through and where we go from here. And I think a lot of folks who are new to Colorado may be a little confused by what's sometimes called the Colorado paradox. We have a state with more college graduates per capita than most other places in the nation. We have higher incomes on average than most other places, although of course our incomes are all taking a hit right now. And yet we don't fund our public schools to the best of our ability. I know that's a product in part of decisions we've made and embedded in the state constitution over the years. You and I and the others on this call had a hand in trying to undo some of that damage. What message are you all taking first to the state legislature, to representatives like Kathy Kipp, who are going back to work, I'm told at least, and Kathy, you should correct us here, but legislature is scheduled to reconvene later this month. Is that right? Let me just take a pause there.
The day after Labor Day.
May 26th. So Lisa,
sorry.
That's all right. It's all blended together right now. So Lisa, what message are you and the advocates at Great Education Colorado taking to legislators who are about to make some very painful decisions?
Well, first, I don't know why this is I seem to be disappearing into the Zoom ether, so I apologize for that, and am too technically inept to fix it. There is a really simple message we've been saying for a long time. Great Education Colorado has a vision of a Colorado where every student, no matter where they live, no matter how they learn, the color of their skin, the language spoken at home, that every student can graduate ready to lead their best life, and that while money alone isn't, and resources alone won't make that happen, without resources it will never happen. And so that message remains the same, and it has been for the 17 years that we've been fighting this fight. There's sort of a new message that we're going to the legislature with that comes from some really remarkable polling that we got just a week ago, before even the depth of the cuts was revealed, and before voters start hearing what those cuts are going to mean in their communities, closing schools, 4-day weeks, etc. So before all this news came down, we had a poll that indicates that by over a 4-to-1 margin, voters want to see rather than deep cuts to schools, they want to see a more fair tax system that taps into the wealth of the folks who have really benefited of the growth from the growth over the last decade. The same people who next year will come out of the COVID recession or cessation, whatever we're calling it, relatively unscathed. So people do not want to see cuts to the services, not just education, but higher education and healthcare and transportation. They prefer to see a more fair tax code that makes sure that everybody pays their fair share. And so that's really remarkably important for the legislature to understand that the old ways of thinking about this may be, it may be changed now, that the vast majority of voters, including a majority of Republicans, Democrats and unaffiliated, a majority of folks from every part of the state, want to see a more fair tax system and to protect the services that we care about. And I think that's a really important message for the legislature to hear.
So let me turn back to the legislature for a second there. And thanks, Lisa. Kath Kipp, you're in the legislature. You're headed back in a couple of weeks. Your constituents, if Lisa's right, and I haven't known her 25 years, I'm pretty sure she is, are going to say, hey, protect the programs that we value most, including public education, from cuts. At the same time, you've got to figure out a way to balance the budget right now, because that's a constitutional requirement and you can't go home until you do. So how do you, as a lawmaker and a former school board president and a parent, and how do you balance these competing demands?
Well, what I tell everybody who writes to me about this and who calls me about it, I got into the legislature to try and solve these fiscal problems. We have a funding crisis because of budget amendments to the Constitution that were passed in the 1980s and the 1990s, and have gotten us to the point where the legislature seems to be, impotent, really, in terms of being able to deal with these issues. So I am hoping that while I'm down there, at some point we can get these issues resolved. So I think this is a really big part of trying to get equitable education for every kid, is solving the funding issue. So what I tell people when they write me, it's like, yeah, I'm working really hard, but it's not going to be enough. There's simply not going to be enough money when K-12 education is 36% of the state of the general fund right now, and we have to cut 25% of the general fund. And there's not a lot of fat in the state budget. There's some things that we simply, like, we can't release everybody from jail. We have to pay for the Department of Corrections. We have human services. We have lots of things that the state has to and is required and needs to fund, and there's not much fat there. But what I tell people, there's two possible ways out. One of the ways out, well, not total ways out, it's not going to totally solve the problem, but first, we're really hoping that the federal government is willing to send some aid to state and state and local governments to help us shore up our budgets. The money that's been sent out thus far does not allow us to spend the money on these holes in our budgets, which have been created from you know, the economic devastation from the lack of revenue that we'll be collecting. They only allow us to spend it on things that are directly related to coronavirus, like putting up temporary hospitals or buying more PPE or whatever those types of things are. But so we're really hoping that that will come through. At this point, it looks like it might come through. Maybe not in time for us to avoid making some of these cuts, at least initially. The other thing, and that's what I think Lisa Weil was alluding to, is FairTax Colorado, also known as Initiative 271, which would give a tax cut to most Coloradans and create a graduated income tax in the state of Colorado. And so people would pay more on their higher rates of income, which would generate revenue for Colorado. And half of that would basically go to education and half could be used for other purposes. And so it's really a very timely initiative, but we have an issue getting it on the ballot. So honestly, anybody who writes me and is concerned about the budget, that's what I'm telling them. Please go and look this up and get involved, because the legislature can't do it on its own.
Let me see if I can just structure the conversation around decisions. To your point, Kathy, the legislature can't do this all on its own. So Tracy, maybe you can start us off by helping us understand, what can the state do? What can the feds do? What can a local school district do? And what are the sorts of things, as Lisa and Kathy are both talking about, that only the voters can do? I know this is a lot to chew on. And I, by the way, I should acknowledge to our viewers, I gave none of my friends here much notice at all about this conversation, but I know they've been working on it for a good chunk of their lives. So I've nothing but confidence in their ability to navigate this. So, so Tracy, what is within the range of motion? Just start with the state, I guess. The legislators are going back. Kathy mentioned the combination of constitutional requirements, federal mandates, and the parts of the budget that are sort of on autopilot. So how much wiggle room does the state have now?
So there's not a lot of wiggle room, and there's also a timing issue. The school boards have to adopt or approve a budget by June 30th, which means that they have to have a budget introduced to them 30 days prior to that, to their community. Doesn't mean that they can't make changes in that after they adopt it. But it is also problematic because they're trying to hire teachers. They're trying to figure out how they're going to reopen school next year. They're trying to figure out, you know, what is education in a COVID environment. There are a lot of unknowns right now, and at the same time, they are required to have a balanced budget. And at this point, they also do not know what kind of dollars for sure they're going to have to work with. They know that it's going to be considerably less than what they have now.
There's a lot of folks. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
And there are a lot of folks ask me, well, gosh, can't the legislature reallocate lottery dollars? Can't you do something different with marijuana dollars? The folks may not know that those dollars are largely spoken for through the state constitution. So only a ballot measure could change that. I'm along the right lines here? Right.
I think there's a misperception that, you know, you've got all this marijuana money. Well, the money that came in for marijuana was primarily directed towards facility projects for schools, for communities that have low assessed valuation. And it's been a huge help, but the amount of money that has come in for that is not even enough money to build a middle school. So it's a great help. It's a wonderful matching program. It has done huge wonders for a lot of our small rural communities, but it can't be used for general operating. As for, you know, redistribution of funds that have been allocated or approved by voters for other initiatives, again, that can't be redirected towards K-12. So really you're looking at the issue of the local property tax dollars, which are the first amount of money that goes into funding schools. And then the rest is at the legislative level. They have limited room of where they can shift some of their dollars. They, you know, when you talk about prioritization, I think obviously, education is a top priority for many people, but their hands really are somewhat tied in this environment unless they wanted to refer something to the ballot. There's also talk right now of utilizing an emergency tax. And then there's also obviously the push to be able to see if there's any leeway with any federal dollars. A combination of those things are kind of the only avenues they have right now that would be able to potentially get them to November, which then hopefully, as Representative Kip mentioned, Initiative 271 could be a solution that would be more longer lasting, more sustainable, and have a direct impact on improving K-12.
I'm going to talk about that ballot measure, I guess, with Lisa here, but one of the viewers is asking about an emergency bond measure that a school district might be able to offer instead of selling off property. Is that a possibility that any of the districts that you all have worked with are contemplating?
I don't know if it's an emergency bond measure. Obviously, a school district can refer a mill levy question or a bond question to their voters and increase property taxes. So they have that latitude, and those can be initiated by, I can't remember the exact deadline, but it's, I think they have to give notice in June if they are moving forward with something potentially for this November, finalize a ballot question by early September. Those are options, but I think unless there's been a lot of groundwork done by communities ahead of time, it's hard to do that, especially in a COVID environment, to make sure that people understand what is going to be put on the ballot. But yes, a local election obviously is always an option, but it doesn't have to be just centered around an emergency. It would be, for a period of time if they wanted to limit it, or for a specific dollar amount, or it could be for a capital project and make it specifically for a bond.
Let me ask just about the ballots. And Lisa, you put together an enormous coalition of school leaders, school board members, superintendents, parents, teachers, principals over the years. Have any of the school districts that you've been working with told you they're going to head themselves to the ballot now, or are they waiting for a statewide measure?
I don't know that anybody's waiting, and Tracy, who has been an incredible partner in pulling all those organizations together with the CSFP, I think there were a lot who are absolutely planning on going. I think Denver was certain they were going to go for a mill levy, and Cherry Creek was certain they were going to go for a mill levy. And I don't know if the decision now is we have to go, because if we don't, the consequences of these state cuts are just too devastating, or if they will be thinking again because a property tax now might not be the best tax to choose. And so I think one of the things that, and I'll let Tracy respond, she knows more about the locals, but I think it's just a really dynamic situation, more so than I've ever seen before, politically, policy-wise, that, a while ago, 3 months ago, I would have said, I'm sure we can get on the ballot because of the coalition that we pulled together, and we did it before with Amendment 73. And I don't know if we'll have the resources to be able to get the message across and win. And it's completely flipped now, because it's going to be difficult to get on the ballot when there's no People's Fair and there's no Cherry Creek Arts Festival. But if we get on the ballot, I think we're going to win. And that is a new dynamic, because it's always been, it was a difficult decision, I know, back in 2018 when we did Amendment 73, which would have done a progressive income tax for schools, that local districts were saying, well, we really want 73 to pass, but we have to do what we do locally because it seems so unlikely that we'll win at the state level. And I think that calculation might be reversed.
Can I ask you just about that for any of you, really, that asking voters to spend money they don't have now when their own incomes have gone down and their jobs have disappeared, in many cases, and 33.5 million Americans have filed for unemployment. Like, how do you make that case to voters now?
The very easy case for Initiative 271, FairTax Colorado, is that we couldn't agree more. And so the only people who will pay this tax, 95% of voters will get a tax cut. All income under $250,000 gets a tax cut. It's only those who make it through to next year in a way. Listen, I think people should thank their lucky stars if they next year after COVID have more than $250,000 income, and they will be a part of this tax. So you're absolutely right. And that's why the main thing we have to do is get across to people, this is making our tax code fair. Right now, the higher your income, the lower a percent of your income you're paying in state and local taxes. We have an upside down tax system. This makes it more fair by reducing the taxes on those who are below, earning less than 250,000, and reversing that upside down nature of our system. So absolutely, this is not the time for a flat tax increase. This is not the time for a sales tax increase. It is the time for a fair tax so that we can invest in the public services that not only provide the services like education and health, but also create jobs and people who can, consumers our teachers can afford to pay their rent and to eat at restaurants.
It's important to underline this point because I think a lot of folks look at the federal tax code and think, well, gosh, that's progressive, maybe not as progressive as you might like, but progressive system. Colorado's income tax is flat and constitutionally required to be flat. That's why you got to go back to the ballot if you want to change it. Well, Kathy, how does that sell in your district? If you went to voters as an advocate for this proposition in Larimer County and said, we want to give you a tax cut, we're going to generate more revenue because we're going to make the code progressive instead of flat. Is that, and we're going to dedicate the revenue to schools. I know I'm probably overly simplifying this proposal, but is that a proposition that your constituents would embrace?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the people in my district, and you know, to be clear, you're going back to talk about, you know, well, what will your voters do for you locally? That has been done over the years and has increased the inequities throughout our state, because only the districts that can afford to put forward a tax and get it passed, and only the wealthier districts really are the ones that tend to pass these things. If voters are in places where they don't get passed, school kids are getting left behind because this just increases the inequity. So I think that I really like this idea because it is an equitable solution. It's going to increase what we all bring to the table. Doing it on a piecemeal basis just has not worked in our state to provide a uniform and equitable education to all of our kids throughout the state. So yeah, I think that's going to sell well here. And most people are going to get a tax cut. I mean, heck, why would anybody turn that down?
Why would they turn it down? Tracy, I know you and I worked along with Lisa and others on a pair of propositions back in the previous decade, Referendum C, which provided us some relief from Tabor and fixed the ratchet effect. And another proposal back in 2008, along with Kerry Kennedy, a plan called the Savings Account for Education, or SAFA, a rainy day fund that would come in handy right now. Voters turned that down though then in 2008, and obviously it's hard to save money, hard to create a rainy day fund when it's already raining. We should have been doing this, it seems to me at least, before now. But when you're talking to the districts, as Lisa mentioned, Tracy, that are calculating the impact of the cuts on themselves or the benefits of a proposal like this, I think seems like a lot of school districts and their constituents will want to know what's in it for me. How do I know that if I pass a statewide measure that any of the benefits are actually going to materialize where I live and serve the schools where my kids go?
So one of the things that we did with Amendment 73 a couple of years ago and are going to be able to do with FairTax Colorado as well is we will be able to show what it means for each of their school districts. So when they're having those conversations, we'll be able to say, here's the new revenue that is coming in, and therefore they can have those local conversations and say, and this is what it means for our district. And that, I think, is what makes this very different than other proposals that were in the past, other than Amendment 73, is because there wasn't that assurance that they could say a benefit for their own community. And this now becomes very tangible. And they can say, okay, in my school district, this is what these dollars are going to be used for, and they can equate it to people and programs, or reducing class sizes, or making, being able to add back after the cuts that they've had to take. So there creates an ownership, and that's also what helps in having people believe in. This is why it is so important that, for example, 271 could benefit them long term. This isn't just dollars coming in for 1 year and then will go away. This has the sustainability component, and then they can distribute it in their schools where they deem the most need.
Are the details of this proposal available either on the Colorado School Finance Project website or the Great Education Colorado website, or both?
Both, and on FairTax Colorado. So
Maybe
on our website, a calculator, people can go in, put in their income, and they can actually see, okay, will I be impacted, and what kind of refund will I get back?
And you are what, csfp.org?
Yes.
And greated.org?
Greateducation.org. And the most direct way to get involved is fairtaxcolorado.org. That's where you can sign up for a petition and all kinds of other resources, ideas about how to safely gather signatures during COVID. We've got some volunteers who are incredibly creative, and they're ahead of us in figuring out how to do that.
It's two more quick questions. Sorry, please,
Well, if I could just say that one of the things that Coloradans have historically been willing to do in terms of taxes is pass a tax that somebody else has to pay. And that's what this is, frankly. It's a tax that the wealthy people have to pay, right? I mean, think back to the marijuana tax. If you don't smoke marijuana, you don't have to pay that. So this is sort of a similar type of thing in that most people aren't going to have to pay it. So we really think that it has a good chance of passing.
Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree. I've heard that line before. So two more quick questions, and then I want to turn to a different subject. Tracy, just real quick, Lisa and I were talking a little bit about what local school districts might be headed to the ballot to ask. Do you know of any among the 178 school districts in Colorado, if my math is still right?
You're right. I would, I have to agree with Lisa. I think initially there were a lot of districts that were contemplating going this fall. I would say all of those conversations have kind of come to a screeching halt right now, and are kind of waiting to test the waters here again in the next 30 days. When school districts decide to go for an election, this process has been something that they've been undertaking for probably a year. And they've been educating their community and talking about what the dollars were going to be used for, or what the building projects were going to be. And now a lot of that has been turned a little bit upside down. So I would say that we'll know that more in about 30 to 60 days, but it'll be a very different environment than what the normal cycle is. And we always track that, but I would say right now, no one is out there really talking about it.
So some folks are talking about this conversation on Facebook, and I want to bring in a couple questions that are coming online. I know this is a conversation that only a policy wonk like me could love, but I'm glad there are about 1,000 people who have joined us so far. So Dee's asking if it's possible to give a brief overview of the Tabor Emergency Tax Fund, and if it does or could impact school districts in any way. Somebody want to tackle that?
Sure, Lisa and I can tag team on that one. We've done that quite a bit lately. In the Tabor Amendment, there is a clause that allows for the legislature to impose an emergency tax based on something other than a fiscal emergency. So this obviously being COVID and is health related. It would require 2/3 of a vote, both in the House and in the Senate. And then that tax would be implemented up and through November of the year of when the next election basically is. And so this would be an opportunity for the legislature to put into place a temporary measure authorized under Tabor that would prevent them from having to make as deep a cuts. Ideally then 271 being the mechanism that would be what is on the ballot, that would be the sustainable component that would move forward. Just because the legislature would put this temporary tax in place does not automatically make it referred in November. That is a separate action. So this would allow them time to see if any other federal dollars come in, if they are able to ideally get behind 271 also, and be able to create that opportunity to not have the loss that there could be for school districts. An example, research was done by Education Commission of the States, who does work, bipartisan work for legislators. It's anticipated that if the cuts that have to be made in the 15 to 20% range in Colorado, we could lose about 5,500 teachers. That obviously would be devastating to the economies, given that K-12 is typically one of the largest, if not the largest employer in all communities.
I want to talk a little bit about teachers because there's another question coming in along those lines too, and we'll be putting more teachers and more stakeholders on these conversations as we go forward. I know we're at the halfway mark, a little past now. So for those folks who are just joining us, we're having these conversations on andrewromanoff.com/live every Friday at noon, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Mountain Time on different subjects throughout this pandemic. I was talking to a voter earlier this morning who said she couldn't talk right now because she was out whacking weeds. And I know that's where it feels like we are too. And the reason we're in the weeds in part is because we've amended the state constitution over the years in a way that forces a lot of these decisions out of the hands of the legislature and into the hands of voters. Tracy was referencing Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, adopted in 1992, requiring a vote on any change in tax policy that yields more revenue to a school district or a local government or the state itself. There's another earlier amendment, the Gallagher Amendment, that comes into play. I know I'll invite the man himself at some point to join us, former city auditor, state senator Dennis Gallagher. But is there any conversation, just a quick show of hands, any conversation going on about the changes to that amendment, which sets a ratio of residential to business property taxes? Lisa's saying yes, there is such a conversation.
Yes.
Tracy's saying there should be. Is it headed to the
There,
ballot?
there actually is. What Gallagher does is balance how much money comes from residential and non-residential or business property. Without going into the 5-minute explanation of how it goes, when the value of business property goes down, it has this converse effect, and it requires the residential assessment rate, which is the percent of the value of a home that we even tax, to go down. We started off back in 1982 when it passed at 21%. So if you imagine like your living room and your dining room and maybe your kitchen was being taxed, we're now down to 7% because of this one of the many formulas we've put into the Constitution. And there's an automatic ratcheting down right now of the residential assessment rate. What this means, and I try to, it's such a hard one to simplify, but because if you think about the relative value of business property and residential property, residential values have not dropped. It's not like the Great Recession when that was just plummeted. They're actually holding steady, but business values, the value of business property has plummeted. If we don't know if businesses are going out of business, we'll stop paying rents, et cetera. And so the bottom line is that if we don't do something, and it's all these formulas working together, it will reduce the amount of property tax paid by total paid for schools alone by $500 million. And all that's, I'm sorry about the complicatedness of this, but if we continue the formulas in place, the state will have to come up with an extra $500 million next year to backfill what will be lost because of the Gallagher Amendment, because of all these formulas. And it's just going to exacerbate the difficulty because the state doesn't have another $500 million to put into that.
I didn't warn our
Somebody
viewers
else
they're going to
can
need a
said that in
pencil and
10
paper.
words. I just wanna-
No, it's fine. I didn't warn folks they'll need a pencil and paper for the rest of this conversation. Here's an easier number to remember because it comes from Liz. She's asking, and I'll start with you, Kathy. Liz is asking if there's been any conversation about a mandatory first-year starting salary for teachers of $45,000. Can you tell us, I know, so you ran a school board, and now you are help running the state as a legislator. Can you help us understand sort of where decisions about salaries get set, and if you have an opinion on where what that number should be?
Well, Colorado is a very local control state, and you will also find that because of that, our salaries for teachers vary quite a bit throughout the state. Right? Colorado has been very adamant about keeping that to be a local decision. Keep in mind that if the state made a mandatory $45,000 minimum salary, that we would then be responsible for coming up for the money to pay that. The nice thing about FairTax Colorado, not to get back to that, but is that the money would go to educator salaries. So that's a really good thing. We know that Colorado teacher salaries are lower than anybody else in the entire country, and that's not okay. So we are wanting to improve that, but I think in order to improve it, as a legislature, we really want to be able to give more money to local school districts so that they can make those decisions at the local level.
Thoughts on, Tracy Rainey or Lisa Weil, any quick thoughts on starting salaries and whether voters would have some guarantee, as Kathy's suggesting, that they would, those dollars would actually go to teachers and classrooms?
So in 270,
yeah,
in FairTax Colorado, that actually is the focus of where dollars are to go, is to ensure that it's going to recruit, retain, and train and teacher pay, in addition to teachers and support staff. So that would mean for those psychologists or social, people delivering mental health services, things along those lines, so that those are where those dollars will go. I don't know of any district that is ever wanting to not put money into teacher salaries or to be able to offer more services for students. It's just that they have not had that capacity given the revenue shortfalls that we continue to experience since the Great Recession.
And I would just add to that, I think that is a very important policy conversation that this state can have, but cannot have that conversation for another decade, considering the cuts that are going to be made unless we pass FairTax Colorado, in which case, as the economy recovers, and especially as the wealthier folks in the economy, the last decade, the real growth in incomes was at the top of the income scale. And so as this economy grows, we will be able to invest more, and then we can have conversations like that. Right now, the conversation we have to have is how do we minimize the cuts? And some districts are going to need to pay more teachers. Some districts may be able to pay teachers more, but until we have a really strong foundation of funding, I think it's a critical conversation, but not until we've come out of this crisis and have put in place the ability to really fund our schools in a more meaningful way.
Let me switch gears for a second and ask you each a question. You're now the Secretary of Education.
I am?
This is a happy premise, frankly. I would vote for any of you over Betsy DeVos, the Secretary, yes, the United States Secretary of Education. So Betsy DeVos has gone home. Donald Trump has gone wherever he's headed. This is a nonpartisan conversation, so this is just a hypothetical. I'm actually not nonpartisan. I have a preference there. I'd like to replace them both. So you've got a chance to make the federal government a partner to public education rather than an obstacle and an opponent. What do you do as Secretary of Education? I know you're enjoying this premise, Lisa, but for any of you, what do you do in that role? And maybe as it relates to this conversation, because I'm obviously running for federal office, but mindful that the responsibility for at least the lion's share of school funding lies at a state and a local level. So what can the feds do? What should they do? What are they doing now, if anything?
If I were the grand stomper, if I could snap my fingers, I would say you're right that most of the funding does not come from the federal government, and a conversation for the future is, should the federal government be doing more to equalize among the wealth of states to make sure that all kids have opportunities. But you know, if there is something to the bully pulpit that is being used in a way that's much more about privatizing right now. I have thought for a long time that the most important thing that we could do for education for the decades, the generations to come, is to create the leadership and the financial ability for parents to be having a conversation, to set the stage so that parents have a conversation with their high school kids and say, sweetie, if you don't get those grades up, you're not going to get to be a teacher. We need people to think about teaching as the highest, it is the highest profession. I think people think that, but my own son was saying, you know, I talked to my friends and we all thought it'd be really cool to be teachers. And I said, are you gonna? And they're like, and he said, no, none of us are gonna. You know, it's not, you can't, it's not a profession that you can, you know, have a house with anymore. And so it's not just the pay, it's the respect, it's the working conditions. But, you know, if you look at Finland, that is what happens. That if you want to be a teacher, man, you know, it is what people aspire to. We need to elevate that profession in every possible way. And that is going to be transformational, not just for education, but for the entire nation and the economy.
Kathy, to either point, you have a couple of kids college age now?
Yeah, I have one that just graduated from college last week, thought that we had a ceremony or anything, and I have one that's still in college. Yeah, gosh, if I were Secretary of Education, man, that would be an opportunity. I think what I would start with was Betsy DeVos's most recent advice, which was to distribute some of the money to the private schools as well as public schools, because she thinks that kids who can afford to go to private school should be getting the federal dollars. And my belief is that public money should go to public education. That's just a principle where I start from. I would also, you know, all of the advice on, let's take college campuses, let's roll back what she rolled back in terms of, you know, the sexual assault guidance that she's come out with. That makes it harder for people to seek justice there. Let's also go back to the transgender restroom issue. I mean, hello, what area are we not touching in our society that doesn't have to do with education? She's also done some pretty horrific things related to student loan debt in our country. So I think that there are a lot of things that we can do to go to a much better place. And yeah, if I had that hat on, man, I'd be getting busy. But thanks for that dream opportunity.
I just want to give you a happy premise to start the day. You know, when I started the campaign, I told somebody that I would begin my education policy by just doing the opposite of whatever Betsy DeVos is doing. We put a little more thought into it and laid out a platform at andrewromanoff.com. If you go to the section of our website, andrewromanoff.com/priorities, you can see the details. I was thinking, though, to your point, Kathy, that we ought to print up a new hat that says, "Make education public again." We'll send the proceeds to the Colorado School Finance Project and to Great Ed Colorado. So Tracy, not just as the Secretary of Education, and I would vote for you for that job in a heartbeat, but if you were making federal policy, let's say you were serving in the U.S. Senate, what are the sorts of things that the feds can do to help states like Colorado improve public education, particularly as it relates to funding?
Sure. I think a lot of it goes back to the idea of creating that partnership and not have it be an entity that is looking at just measurement or kind of punitive or being assuming the worst. And I think that goes to then thinking about making improvement for different types of students, you know, serving in Congress. Obviously, there are opportunities for discussion and having the bully pulpit to be able to talk about, you know, are there different populations of students that we should be ensuring that we are serving? Who is being left behind? You know, how do we ensure that education is that great equalizer? That no matter where you were born or what color your skin are, you have the same opportunity as somebody who has all the opportunities. And I do think that it's a great opportunity to think about the conversations that we haven't had in a long time, that, you know, readdress DACA again, readdress the issues around special education students and ensuring that they have access to the funding that the feds are trying to provide. And, you know, is that the right level of funding? And what kind of programs should we be expanding or ensuring that it's really set for the 21st century? I just think it's an opportunity to really re-engage a commitment to the states in a partnership.
Let me just pick up on one of the points that you mentioned, Tracy, in the few minutes that we have left about the role of education as an equalizer. The state made a commitment back in 1876, as you all know, to create a thorough and uniform system of free public schools. We guaranteed that in the Constitution as soon as was practicable. It is, 144 years later. I think a lot of kids are still waiting for us to make good on that commitment. But it's pretty clear that the quality of your education, your access to education happens to depend on your zip code, on your parents' bank account, on this color of your skin. And the COVID crisis, which is the subject of a lot of our town halls over the last few weeks, obviously has exacerbated and exposed the vast inequalities in every walk of life, right? So you've got African-American families in the United States holding only 1/10 the wealth on average of white families. You've got a gap between rich and poor that is wider than at any point in 100 years. And this, to me, is a real indictment of where things stand. So when it comes to education policy, and maybe 271, the ballot measure that we've been talking about today, or other changes in state or federal or local policy could address this, but how do we build an education system that actually remedies rather than worsens the gaps that afflict so many parts of American life? Particularly, I'll just ask to narrow the conversation around communities of color and low-income communities in Colorado. It seems to me a system that bases education funding, at least in large part, on the value of your property is inherently inequitable.
I would answer that. That has to be answered on two levels. And one is, how are we distributing, how much are we distributing in funding, but how are we distributing it? And there's been a lot of talk. The superintendents all came together with a plan to distribute through a new School Finance Act, the dollars in a way that really does take more into account for poverty and for special education and learning differences. And I hope that once we pass FairTax Colorado and in the years that come where we're really recovering and investing more, that those dollars will be distributed at the state level in a way that really makes up for the income maladjustments and the inequities around the state. The second thing, though, is and this is something that Great Education Colorado has been really working toward and thinking about how to implement, an idea that once the dollars go to the school districts, it's really critical that the voice of those people in those communities is heard. I think there are a lot of folks, equity has been a goal for a lot of people for the last decade in the reforms that have come down, but we're not reaching out to all the communities in a really authentic way to make sure that when decisions are, if you're engaging the community, but you're not talking about how the dollars are spent, then you're not really engaging it. I think, I love this quote because it's attributed to both Gloria Steinem and Billy Graham. But if you want to know, what people care about, look at their checkbook. So it's got to be true of both Gloria Steinem and Billy Graham. So we're looking at what we're talking about is inclusive budgeting, and we have a lot of support from school districts because it's not easy to do, and it does take resources to do authentic communication, to really hear what is it that communities of color, the investments that will really make a difference in their children's lives, whether it's cultural competency training, anti-racism training, investments in various, we don't know. I certainly don't know what would be most meaningful. And I think that's the future, is in making sure that communities are heard in a really authentic and intentional and ongoing way, to make sure that the dollars are spent the way that will make the most impact on those kids.
The easy question, Kathy, if the communities that you represent want to reach you and take Lisa's advice and make sure their voices are heard, how do they best do that?
Kathy Kipp 52 at gmail.com. So Kathy is with a C, Kipp is with a K, C-A-T-H-Y, K-I-P-P, at 52, that's my district, at gmail.com, or just look it up on the Colorado General Assembly website. But send me an email. That's really the best way to get in touch with me.
And I know you're holding virtual town halls as well. I think you and Senator Janal have one coming up.
We have one tomorrow at 1 o'clock on nonprofits.
Got it. Yeah. Well, we'll put some of the links to these sites there. And we're almost out of time, and I'm just reflecting a lot, Tracy, on a trip that you and Lisa and Kathy and Gephardt and Carey County and I took a trip through the San Luis Valley and other parts of Colorado. And I remember in particular a story I'll share with you briefly now. We visited schools where the roofs were caving in or the floorboards were too rotten to hold up a desk. We took a group of legislators with us and built what became Building Excellent Schools today, the $1 billion plan to repair schools and invest in capital construction, more than we've ever invested as a state, at least in that part of the budget. And I remember in particular a conversation that we had with a young woman we met in the San Luis Valley, a girl who was going to school and embarrassed that we were visiting, especially embarrassed when other teens would come and laugh at the conditions where she and her classmates were sent, sometimes to study in trailers that had been parked outside the school building and designated as temporary instructional facilities, but trailers that have been there for 30 years. Hard to call them temporary at one point. I remember this student turned to me. I was the Speaker of the House at the time, to Carey Kennedy, who was the state treasurer, to all of us in that coalition. And she said, well, how come you don't care as much about me as you do about kids back in Denver or Cherry Creek or wherever you're from? I thought, well, you deserve a better answer to that question, and it's why we work so hard to pass those measures. But kids pick up on the signals we send, and in part where we decide to send them to study, what we think of them, what we value, to Lisa's point earlier. So what's the message? It's a tough question in the 60 seconds we have left, but I mean, we owe that young woman and every kid in Colorado a better answer, it seems to me. Do you have some words of wisdom to close us with, Tracy?
Wow. I think you're right. We can do better in Colorado. We are a wealthy state, and I think we need to make sure that we are really thinking about our future, and our future is our students, and they are going to be our economic engine of the future. And if we aren't willing to invest in them, then we are not going to have the outcome that we want for Colorado. And so I think that is something that people really need to understand. Go ahead.
That's the spirit, I think, that drives. I didn't do much justice to the organizations that you and Lisa lead, but that seems like the heart of the work that the Colorado School Finance Project and Great Education Colorado are dedicated to, right? The notion that your ability to succeed and flourish and thrive shouldn't depend on forces beyond your control, as they too often do. I admire the work that each of you are doing, and I know this is a tough time, especially when you got a guy like me calling you, because some case I think with an hour's notice to say, hey, can you join a conversation? We're going to post this conversation on our website at andrewromanoff.com. We're going to continue the conversation, I know, in the months ahead, and well, particularly if I end up on the ballot and 271 ends up on the ballot, we'll have a conversation about what the voters of Colorado can do as well. So I want to say to Tracy Rainey, to Lisa Wild, to Kathy Kipp, thank you each for your leadership and your dedication and your recognition that we, as Tracy said, can do better. that's the commitment that I'm taking to my own endeavor here as well. You can follow this conversation again at andrewromanoff.com. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter at Romanoff2020. We'll post links. Kathy's kindly offered her own personal email, so we'll take advantage of that and post all these links in our website as well. Thank you each, and thanks to the folks who have joined us. I know we had more than 1,000 people join this virtual town hall, which is terrific. So I hope you and your families continue to stay safe and healthy. And thanks to my guests as well. Have a great day.
Thank you.
you.